The Secret Garden, Chapter 1, Misstlethwaite Manor. When Mary Lennox came to Misstlethwaite Manor to live with her uncle, everyone said she was the most disagreeable-looking child ever seen. She arrived from India after an epidemic of deadly cholera had swept through that country like a hot, relentless wind. Many people had died, and among them were Mary's parents. Now, were it not for her uncle Archibald Craven, Mary would have found herself quite alone in the world. She did not miss her parents, for she had hardly known them. Her father had always been busy, and her mother, who had not wanted a little girl at all, had handed her over to the care of servants from the time Mary was born. As she was a sickly child, all the servants obeyed her and gave her her own way in everything. And now that her parents and all her servants were gone, she fully expected that whoever took care of her next would continue to obey her and give her whatever she demanded. Mary had a thin little face and a thin little body, thin light hair, and a very sour expression. She never smiled, not once during the long voyage to England. This she made under the care of an officer's wife, who was rather glad to hand her over to the woman that Mr. Archibald Craven sent to meet her in London, his housekeeper, Mrs. Medlock. "My word, she's a plain little piece of goods," said Mrs. Medlock of Mary, who pretended not to hear. "Perhaps she will improve as she grows older," the officer's wife said good-naturedly. "She'll have to alter a good deal," answered Mrs. Medlock. "And there's nothing likely to improve children at Misstlethwaite, if you ask me." Mary did not like the stout woman, whose flushed face she found common, but as she very seldom liked people, there was nothing remarkable in that. Still, she could not help but wonder about her uncle and the place he lived in. She had heard he was a hunchback. What was a hunchback, she wondered? She had never seen one. The next day they set out on their journey to Yorkshire. Mary sat in her corner of the railway carriage and looked plain and fretful. Her black dress made her skin look yellower than ever, and her limp hair straggled from under her black hat. "I suppose you might as well be told something about where you're going to," said Mrs. Medlock gruffly. "It's a queer place." Mary said nothing at all. Mrs. Medlock looked rather put out by her apparent indifference, but went on. "The house is 600 years old, and it's on the edge of the moor, and there's near 100 rooms in it, though most of them shut up and locked. And there's a park round it, and gardens and trees." She paused and took a breath. "But there's nothing else," she ended suddenly. Mary sat still. "What you're to be kept at Misstlethwaite Manor for, I don't know. He's not going to trouble himself about you, that's sure and certain. He never troubles himself about no one." She stopped herself as if she had remembered something just in time. "He's got a crooked back," she said. That set him wrong. He was a sour young man and got no good of all his money and big place till he was married. Mary's eyes turned toward Mrs. Medlock in spite of her intention to seem not to care. Seeing this, the housekeeper continued. "She was a sweet, pretty thing, and he'd have walked the world over to get her a blade of grass she wanted. When she died—" "Oh, did she die?" Mary exclaimed, quite without meaning to. Suddenly she felt sorry for Mr. Archibald Craven. "Yes," Mrs. Medlock answered, "and it made him queerer than ever. He cares about nobody. He won't see people, and 10 to 1 he won't see you. Most of the time he goes away, and when he's at Misstlethwaite he shuts himself up in the west wing." Mary gazed out the train window at the gray rainstorm, which looked as if it would go on forever. "You mustn't expect that there will be people to talk to you," Mrs. Medlock said. "You'll have to play alone and look after yourself." The grayness grew heavier and heavier before Mary's eyes, and she fell asleep. It was quite dark when she awakened. "You have had a sleep," Mrs. Medlock said. "We're at Thwaite Station. A carriage is waiting. We've a long drive before us." Inside the carriage, Mary sat and looked out the window, curious to see something of the road over which she was being driven to the queer place Mrs. Medlock had spoken of. There was no knowing what might happen in a house with 100 rooms, nearly all shut up, a house standing on the edge of a moor. On and on they drove through the darkness, and though the rain stopped, the wind rushed by and whistled and made strange sounds. Mary felt the wide, bleak moor was an expanse of black ocean through which she was passing on a strip of dry land. "I don't like it," she said to herself. "I don't like it," and she pinched her thin lips tightly together. Mary could not see the house clearly when at last they arrived, except that it was immensely long and seemed to ramble around a stone court. One window in an upstairs corner showed a dull glow. "You are to take her to her room," a thin old man instructed Mrs. Medlock. "He doesn't want to see her. He's going to London in the morning." And then little Mary was led up a staircase and down a long corridor, and then down another and another, until finally a door was opened, and she found herself in a room with a fire and a supper on the table. "Well, here you are," said Mrs. Medlock. "This room and the next are where you'll live, and you must keep to them. Don't you forget that." It was in this way that Mary Lennox arrived at Misstlethwaite Manor, and she had perhaps never felt quite so disagreeable in all her life.